السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله، الحمد لله، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وشفيعنا وحبيبنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا، ربنا زدنا علما نافعا، آمين يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everybody, welcome to our second session on the life and times of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. That will be the precursor to our study of his standalone tafsir of Juz Amma and Surah Al-Fatiha. I pray everybody is well, inshallah ta'ala, and remembers from the last session what we covered. So we spoke in the last session about the early life of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, his family origin, his entrance into the Zaytuna University, his climb up the ranks, the acknowledgement of his absolute brilliance and genius. And I also gave some further reading recommendations. The two books, or one of Iyad Khalid al-Tiba', I think is his name, or Taba', and the other one by Nafi' Bashir, which is the academic paper that people can access. Today, what we're going to do, we're just going to move forward by looking at some of his um, further accomplishments. We're going to look at the naturalization crisis properly today in a little bit more detail. We're going to look at some of his relationships with other people, some of his students, some of his friends. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to unpack some reflections people had on his character, his way of being. May Allah have mercy on him. And all of these are just signs of, because he has this immense acceptance in the eyes of um, the ulama generally and also the general public. Very famously, there's a quite nice Al Jazeera documentary on him that people can also watch if you know Arabic. And obviously, there's like this famous story that they always tell about Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, and I'll mention it because Nafi' Bashir mentions it in his paper. Because there's always this idea, and we're going to look at that later when we look at some of his writings, that he was this reformist kind of person who just wanted to completely circumvent and completely corrupt and change and turn upside down, invert as best as he could the Islamic sciences and introduce loads of things that nobody else wanted. And obviously, there was this opposition from the traditionalists, which we're going to talk about today. But one of the famous stories, and I always thought it's apocryphal and it wasn't really true, um, but if Nafi Bashir mentions it, maybe it is true, and he went to the University of London, as it says on his paper, is that he was asked by Bourguiba, who was the leader of Tunisia at that time, to give a fatwa making fasting optional. And the reason was that was given was for the sake of economic efficiency, that people, because they're fasting, they're not able to work as hard, and then suddenly output's going to suffer because the factories are not producing at the level they should be, and the taxi drivers are not driving as much as they should be, and the laborers and the builders are not working as hard as they should be, and ultimately national output, GDP, all of these things are going to suffer. And the famous story is that he comes on the radio and he says, uh, قال تعالى في القرآن المجيد, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed upon you the way it was prescribed on those before you, so that you may become God conscious. And then he says, صدق الله وكذب بُرْغِيبًا. Allah spoke the truth and Bourguiba has lied. That fasting is optional and can be abandoned for the sake of economic efficiency. Now, that part of the story, the radio part, maybe doesn't seem to be as true. I don't know. Maybe somebody could come in the comments, give me some references, and I'm more than willing to correct myself. But what does there is some, it does seem to be some level of truth to this story in and of itself. That he refused to give the fatwa, allowing for people to abandon fasting. He affirmed that fasting is an obligation. That even, as Nafi Bashir says, even in his reform, there was a limit. And the limit was the limit set by Allah and His Prophet ﷺ. And it's always a reminder that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur was a man of tradition. And he did believe. And he was a Maliki Imam. And he taught from the Maliki books. And he defended the Waqf. There's a very famous, I don't know, we're going to talk about it today, but he's also in Egypt. In the early 20th century, there was this attempt there was what was being said that the awqaf, the endowments, were hoarding a lot of the wealth and not allowing access to it by the market and the capitalists. And this is a claim that's been there on Muslims for hundreds of years, really, that Muslims, because of the awqaf, that the endowments, what is an endowment? It's basically this perpetuity that you take this building or you take this thing Obviously, there's a khilaf with what kind of things can you give as endowments. But generally, let's just say you have a building, you give it to God, and it belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the proceeds go to some sort of charitable endeavor. And how long does this last? It lasts forever. And you can put certain conditions in place to decide management and decide where the money goes and decide what are you allowed to do and how you're allowed to carry on the upkeep of the building. And what developed, a lot of these al-waqf al-ahli, family endowments, families in order to protect their wealth from inheritance, from the breakdown of the wealth and the disintegration, and maybe it becomes proliferates here and there, everywhere, and you don't manage to build this legacy amount of wealth or whatever it is, or to allow the wealth to maintain within the family, they would build family endowments that maybe a child of yours would manage. And so there's a lot of documentation and research that's been done on this. And the awqaf, they have precedent from the time of the Sahaba, Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in, from the time of Sayyidina Uthman, the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And I think there's a narration that all of the Sahaba had some form of endowment. But the endowments became a problem for the colonial powers because they couldn't access the wealth of the believers. And they wanted to get their grubby little fingers on Muslim resources, and they couldn't because they were protected by this endowment structure, by the legal structure of the endowments that the fuqaha had written on from Khassaf, sorry, I think of the Hanafis, maybe I think it was, I don't know, but there's this early Hanafi Imams wrote on the endowments, and later in the Ottoman period, like everywhere you go in Istanbul, there's an endowment. A person could live all their life from birth up until death being catered for by endowments, whether that's the healthcare system, whether that's I don't know where their crib comes from, whether that's the utensils they eat with, whatever it is, there's an endowment for it because this was the nature of the charitable giving and generosity of the Muslim empire. Nevertheless, by the time the colonial powers come in and now they want to get access to all of these Muslim resources and they can't. Why? Because you can't touch endowments. You're not allowed to take from endowments. You can't usurp endowments. This is a problem Muslim rulers also had because they maybe wanted to grab wealth so they could go to war, didn't want to carry out taxation, whatever. And so there was this attempt, I think, if I remember correctly, in the Egyptian parliament to nullify the endowments, to attack them, to make arguments that they are economically inefficient and they have to be completely and utterly dismantled. And two great Imams write very, very powerful refutations of this. One of them is Muhammad Hassan Makhluf, rahimahullah ta'ala, if I'm saying his name correctly, who was the Shaykh al-Azhar in his time. And the second defense was written by Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. He writes this book, Al-Waqf wa Atharuhu fil Islam, Waqf and their effects in Islam, in which he defends the awqaf, their positionality, their authority, their preservation, their perpetuity, that people cannot just come in and usurp the wealth of the awqaf, that they are not economically inefficient, that they have a duty and a function and they carry out that duty and the function. And maybe there is some leeway to the legalities of the awqaf can be changed as they were with the cash awqaf and other things in the Ottoman Empire, but he writes this incredible defense. Now, why do I know about this? Because I read the book and I spent some time with this topic. But all I'm trying to make the point here is that he is a traditional scholar. He is trying to defend Islam. He's not somebody, even in his writings, when he writes in his tafsir, when he writes in his books, he's not a modernist. He's not saying throw off the hijab and do all of these things. So when they call him a reformist scholar, they don't mean like he's one of those weird deformist scholars who's coming and literally wants to chop and change Islam for the sake of colonial authority and liberal philosophies and whatever else. What he is somebody who reckons with the tiger of modernity, as Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad would say. And he wants to make Islam make sense in the age that he resides in. And he does a phenomenal job. And he is an incredible mind and an incredible authority. And so I don't know why, I didn't even intend to make this point. I've ended up spending the first 10 minutes of this talking about this. But I just want people to acknowledge that. He's not like Abdu. Even Nafi Bashir in his paper, he makes it very clear. He's not like Abdu, he's not like Rida, who come in, they like bulls in a china shop, destroying everything, knocking everything over, change the curriculum, get rid of Kalam, we need new Kalam, we need new this, fiqh is going to be changed, Transvaal Fatwa, all of these strange rulings coming out of nowhere. No, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur in his fatwa was a man of traditionalism, of integrity. Even though he tried to make certain arguments the Kalam needs to be reformed slightly, even though, even in his writing, in his tafsir, they say he can't escape the school of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. That is his madhab. That is his madhab in creed. He is a Maliki Ash'ari, and he's still held by that tradition. And so he's not somebody who wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, so that's just the point I just want to make. Like we need to acknowledge the traditional grounding that this incredible scholar actually did have. From my limited readings, I'm going to talk about some of his books later, and I'm going to talk about more so the books that I've read. I read Al-Waqf wa Atharuhu fil Islam and some of his other works, and his book on Mawlid and Sirah and things I've read, and I just think he's a phenomenal scholar, and I think he's one of the great scholars of the last century without a shadow of a doubt. Okay, what are his incredible firsts? So this is the Arabic biography mentions. One of the first things he does that nobody else did before him is the first complete Quran exegesis done in Al-Ifriqiyya. Ifriqiya. This is North Africa, the first complete Quran exegesis written from Fatiha to An-Nas, in Arabic in North Africa. And they say that before him, other people had written some tafsir of certain verses, certain extracts of the Quran, but the first time somebody wrote a complete tafsir from beginning to end was Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. Now, obviously, the claim here is not that this is the first complete tafsir written in Africa, because there are probably tafsir written long before that. I'm not an expert on the African tafsir tradition. Somebody like Sheikh Mustafa Briggs and others who research the history of that area, of that region, who are experts on it, will tell us the details of what that means. But he is the first complete mufassir in North Africa. Um, Now, Ifriqiya, I assume, doesn't include Egypt, because I assume there are Egyptian tafsir written from before that period. But it's that specific area of North Africa. They say between Barqa and Tangier, so Morocco, Libya, Algeria, that sort of area. What else does he do? He's the first person to combine the positions of the Sheikh of the Masjid of Zaytuna, the Sheikh of the Grand Mosque of Zaytuna, and also being the Sheikh al-Islam of the Maliki school in Tunisia. Never before had those two positions been combined. He's also the first person to be the Sheikh of the Grand Mosque. Apparently, this is a position that was created specifically to cater to his scholarly and educational reforms. That there were reforms that needed to be made. So a position was created, the Grand Sheikh, like the Dean of the Zaytuna University, but the Grand Sheikh of the Grand Mosque, and he was the first person to hold that position. And he replaced, there was originally like a committee, he became the sole person in charge of that position. Um, and obviously then has the controversy that we'll speak about in a little while. He is the first Maliki to hold the position of Shaykh al-Islam. Before that, the Ahnaf, and actually just before him, Sheikh Muhammad Bayram, and Bayram sounds, it's a Turkish word as far as I know, so maybe he was actually a Hanafi Turk scholar, Allahu Alam, who was the Shaykh al-Islam of the Ahnaf in Tunisia. He loses that position, and for the first time it's given to a Maliki. And I feel ever since then it's only been held by the Malikiyah, and Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur is the first person in Tunisia to hold this. Because the Ottomans, they say here from the 10th Hijri century, it was always restricted to the Ahnaf. He revives the Maqasid al-Sharia. Now, maybe there are people who are experts in Maqasid al-Sharia who say, no, actually there was a scholar between him and Ash-Shatibi or Izz ibn Abd salam. I don't know. This is not an area of my expertise. I don't have many areas of expertise, but the point being is that here there is a claim being made that he's the first person to revive the science of Maqasid al-Sharia. And whether that's true or not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. If people in the comments want to interject and say, no, actually, there was somebody else who wrote, but there's no denying that he writes this book, Maqasid al-Sharia, which I haven't read in its entirety, but I've read about a third of it, the final section on economic philosophy, just because that is an area I do have an interest in. Okay. Now, who are his peers and who are his friends? There's a variety of scholars they mention: Muhammad al-Aziz ibn Yusuf Ja'it, Salih al-Maliqi with a Qaf, Muhammad al-Nakhli, who is his own teacher and influenced him towards the way of Muhammad Abdu, various other mashayikh whose names are mentioned. But the sheikh that he is most known for, or is known to be his closest friend, is another one of my heroes whose books I have read. And so I just thought it'd be a good moment to speak about him and his relationship with Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. And if anybody knows, this is none other than Sheikh Muhammad al-Khadir Hussein, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar in his time, who was a wonderful, wonderful genius scholar of the 20th century. Sheikh Muhammad Khadir Hussein, rahimahullah ta'ala, was a Tunisian. He was the first non-Egyptian, I think, to be Sheikh al-Azhar. Phenomenal scholar, really was. He wrote some very, very powerful books. He has a scathing critique of Ali Abdul Raziq, which we're going to talk about later, because Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, may Allah mercy on him, also has one. He wrote many books on balagha, on Quranic balagha. He wrote a refutation of Taha Hussein on pre-Islamic poetry. He has various works on tafsir. He has some example tafsir that he also wrote. He was a master of the Arabic language. He did a lot of work. Um, he also wrote books on atheism, on secularism. He wrote works on uh, elements of political philosophy, various philosophy within Islam. He's just a phenomenal scholar. You can get Al-A'mal al-Kamila, his entire works, you can download them as PDFs online as well. But for our intents and purposes, we're more focused on the fact that he was a very close friend of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. So both of them become the heads of their respected universities. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur becomes the Grand Sheikh of Zaytuna, and Muhammad Khadir Hussein becomes the Grand Sheikh of Egypt and the first non-Egyptian to carry that position. And this, if I remember correctly, is in the aftermath of all the reformism that was carried out by Abdu and Rida and that cohort. And so he comes off the back of that, and he is somebody who is a lot more traditionally grounded than them. Um, and he's just a phenomenal scholar. He's just a phenomenal, gifted scholar. He has a lot of political agitation that he does. As far as I remember, he's not even Sheikh al-Azhar for a very long time. He's removed from that position by is it Jamal Abdel Nasser who comes in. Again, Egyptian history is not my forte, but there is a government influence forces him out of his position. But both of them they meet as students because obviously Muhammad Khadir Hussein is studies in the Zaytuna because he's from Tunisia, and that is where they both meet for the first time. And they have so many things in common. They both are very focused on the Islamic sciences, of course, but also Arabic literature. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur publishes works in Arabic literature that he does tahqiq on, various diwans, poetry collections, various other writings that are quite prominent in Arabic literature. Muhammad Khadir Hussein does the same. He's also working in Arabic literature, poetry, all of these sciences are things that he has a very powerful grasp of. They both write refutations of Ali Abdul Razik, who we spoke about. This book, Ali Abdul Razik, basically argues that there is no concept of Khilafah in Islam, and this is in the aftermath of the fall of the Khilafah um, as far as I remember, or at least in that sort of period. And so there are a number of scholars who write powerful refutations of him to say, no, there is a political philosophy within Islam, there is a concept of Khilafah, and this is the Ali Abdul Razik sort of I don't know, I was going to call it the crisis of Ali Abdul Razik or something, but it is this moment where the scholars have to reckon with these arguments that are being made that the Khilafah has no real existence in Islamic history. All it has been is just a non-Islamic political authority, and the Prophet ﷺ never intended for Islam to become a political force, and all of the khilafahs that existed were not Islamic. And he makes all of these arguments, and he tries to mobilize different Islamic sources and things to do this. Is refuted by a number of scholars. Two of them are Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, who writes a very short refutation, which we're going to look at later, and Muhammad Khadir Hussein, who writes a slightly more substantial one. Both of them in refutation of him. They both have writings on reform, on the social order of Islam. Muhammad Khadir Hussein has a book on the concept of freedom within Islam. Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur has his own book on social order, Usul al-Nizam al-Ijtima'i, that we spoke about before, fil Islam. So there's all of these things that they have in common. And they also happen to be very good friends. So they would write letters to each other every time they'd hear that it's just a beautiful thing, isn't it? Like just the idea of brotherhood grounded in a love of the ulum Islamiyah, grounded in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so whenever one of them would have an accomplishment, the other one, they would just write poetry to each other because they were both they were experts in the Arabic language. And so you have this constant back and forth of writing, of just expressions of love that the Prophet ﷺ says, when you love your brother, you have to tell him. And these were two brothers in knowledge who loved each other, these Tunisian mashayikh who reached the apex of these great, venerable Islamic institutions. Sorry. And so we have some collections of the poetry that they wrote, where the endeavors of mankind are diverse and each has a goal, but the endeavor of Ibn Ashur has the most sublime aim. A youth who befriended literature from his earliest upbringing. Obviously, there's an original Arabic thing, so it became a soul for him and he became a body for it. And then Muhammad Tahir Khidr Hussein, because he's always moving between the various Islamic lands, because he's trying to help the Muslims in their anti colonial efforts. He's now he writes from Damascus, and he writes his response to him as well. There's also Al-Khadir Hussein has a description of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. I think it might come again later. I saw a tongue whose speech was truth, an inner self pure of every evil thought, an ambition focused on lofty matters, a diligence in the work that he carried out untouched by weariness, a preservation of the duties and the adab of religion. In sum, my admiration for the radiance of his character and the graciousness. Because this is Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. What is he famous for? He's known for being a man of impeccable character, a compassionate, merciful, very sort of, I don't know about stoic, but he was a man who you couldn't antagonize him, and he wasn't a man of dispute. He wasn't a prickly character. He was just such a smooth, merciful, just a clement being. And so he says, my admiration for the radiance of his character and the graciousness of his manners is no less than my admiration for his genius and knowledge. Khadir Hussein says that. That's his peers, like that's like great ulama praising him, showcasing his incredible rank. And they studied together, they spent time together. Like you can only know a person if you travel with them or if you live with them. And they would attend the lessons of Sheikh Salim Buhajib, like we mentioned before, on Bukhari. A lot of the major mashayikh that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur had, that we mentioned in the last session, Imam Khadir Hussein rahimahullah also had the same mashayikh. Sheikh Umar ibn al-Shaykh, Sheikh Muhammad al-Najjar, Sheikh Salim Buhajib, and all these lessons they were attending together. And he just had such love for him, and he just saw that he was a man of incredible genius and just impeccable character. And I just think it's just beautiful to mention that they had this incredible relationship with each other. May Allah have mercy on both of them. The Ashuriya library. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We'll speak about this briefly. Um, this I don't know much about, but this is Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur's personal library, and it's located in the Marsat suburb. Now, this is the suburb where he was born. So I'm not sure if it's actually in. Okay, here it says in Imam Ibn Ashur's palace. Maybe Sheikh Suhaib Saeed, who we're going to talk about later. I have a slide on him. Don't worry, Sheikh Suhaib, if you're watching this and you're thinking, why hasn't he mentioned the Ibn Ashur Center for Quranic Studies? It's coming. I have it in a slide near the end of my presentation, inshallah ta'ala. But I know he has a documentary where he goes and visits and sees the manuscripts of the original tafsir of At-Tahrir wa Tanweer. But it seems to say here, I have it on my notes on the side, that Ibn Ashur had a palace. And I assume this is the palace of his grandfather, his mom's father, who was a very notable diplomat, aristocrat figure. Uh, Estimated 5,000 books, 2,000 printed books, manuscripts, one of the most famous private libraries in the world. The author of the biography has been there, so he's speaking from experience, and it's got some incredible works like Qur'ans, ancient Qur'ans, early manuscripts of the works of Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri, the very famous poet and person of Arabic literature, some dawaween. A lot of the books in there have notes, the marginalia, where Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur has written his own tahqiqat and his hawashi on things. And it was somewhere where Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur would go to find just peace and solace. It was the library, to be surrounded by his books. And many people know I have my library here. This is the spare room. We've just moved house. And all of my books are just boxed up everywhere. And it's a quite sad sight. And inshallah ta'ala soon they will make their way out of captivity into freedom of actually being able to be accessed. But a library for an alim is one of the most beautiful things. It's the most prized possession they have. And so um, apparently this is still available for people to come and visit. And it belongs now to the Ibn Ashur family. And I think it's his grandson now, isn't it? If I remember correctly. His grandson or his great grandson is now carrying out the legacy of the great Imam. Okay. Personal character. Okay, before we talk about personal character, just very briefly, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, he wouldn't travel much, so there's not much account of him actually making many journeys. We have that he went for Hajj multiple times. He made the Hajj multiple times in his life. He visited Istanbul with his son Muhammad al-Fadil, and Muhammad al-Fadil says it was the finest journeys that I ever took in my life. And he loved visiting the landmarks, the books, the ulama of that was in 1951. In 1951, he also visited Damascus again with Muhammad al-Fadil, his son, and he was hosted by the brother of Imam Muhammad Khadir Hussein, rahimahullah ta'ala, who passed away 7 years later. So he was still alive at that time because Muhammad Khadir Hussein passed away in 1958. He visits Cairo on the way back from Hajj. At that time, Muhammad Khadir Hussein is still alive. He visits his friend, Muhammad Khadir Hussein, and that's where a lot of the praise of each other that comes from. and the deep friendship between them, and they spoke about all of these things. Um, so we have some very limited accounts of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur leaving Tunisia. Apparently, there's some visits to Europe as well. But next is the character traits of Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur. And here, there is not a person except they praise him. That he was a man of immense humility. Like he would, if anybody came to him to ask him any questions, he would answer the questions. There's his accounts of his students coming to him to ask him questions, some of the matters that maybe somebody of his caliber shouldn't be engaging with, and he would speak to them with such love. And he would answer their questions, and he was always available to them. He didn't have the pretense of arrogance that I'm such a big sheikh, and how dare you come to me and everybody, and I need an entourage, and I need to be dealt with this. They say he was somebody of immense humility. He was somebody incredibly patient because he went through calamities. We're going to talk about some of the tribulations he goes through in his life because he posits these ideas, unique ideas, revolutionary ideas, and now he gets pushback. People don't like it. There's people whose jobs are at stake. People who's like people who just maybe philosophically don't agree with him. Whatever it is, now these people who are entrenched in position see him as a threat. So they remove him from his position. They make his life difficult for him. But in the face of all of that, he was incredibly calm, incredibly patient, incredibly steadfast. He would never ever complain about people. He never said, "Oh, XYZ person did this, XYZ person said that." Um, he was also somebody. He never wrote refutations. Now, this is interesting because we're going to talk about one of the refutations he writes. But generally, even when he wrote refutations, it was just scholarly. He engaged with the scholarly debate. He wouldn't attack people's character. He wouldn't attack people's appearances. He wouldn't go ad hominem. He was somebody who restricted himself to writing the works of knowledge. He was somebody whose focus was knowledge. He wasn't somebody who engaged in debates. Very, very rarely would he engage in any sort of refutational? Because that's a thing that happens at the moment now. It's all polemics. You have to argue with people, and this is just psychologically so destructive for people. And Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, he was a man who was beyond that. He recognized the futility of debate, how it wastes time, how it just completely erodes the moral integrity of a being, that you just become reduced to this prickly debating person who just wants to argue and just showcase his ability and just creates arrogance within you. And he was also somebody completely devoted to the art of teaching. He was a teacher first and foremost. That was his duty. He was a teacher in the Zaytuna, and he taught there for as long as he could. And he was always reading, and he was always writing, and it was something that he would focus on to the best of his ability. Now we have, okay, we'll come to the testimonials in a second. We have here very quickly his daily habits. So he was incredibly charitable to assistants, scribes, and workers. There was nobody who was beneath him that he would treat with disdain because they had a position that was less than him. He wouldn't eat evening meals. This is mentioned in his biography. And if he was invited to a meal in the evening, he would pretend to eat. Just so, because if he doesn't eat, then maybe nobody else will eat, or they'll feel uncomfortable. And this is known about the Messenger of Allah, alayhi salatu wasalam, Sayyidah Aisha says that he would eat excessively, he would eat to his fill only if there were people around him. Because if they saw that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't eating, they might say, "Oh, he's not eating. So I don't feel comfortable eating if the Messenger of Allah ﷺ doesn't eat." Like if you go to a meal and there's one guy not eating, it becomes strange. And so Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur, he had this prophetic character about him. That even though he wouldn't eat himself, he would pretend to eat, or he would eat small morsels or something in order to encourage those around him to eat, so they could actually partake in the food. He was always reading, he was always writing, and he was always recording, making hawashi, spending time, like we mentioned, in his library, which was his source of solace. Now we have some of the testimonials. This is he himself says, "I find no companionship or pleasant conversation more delightful than conversing with professors and brethren about subtleties of knowledge and refinements of literature, and nothing is more beloved to me than seclusion with book and paper, turning away from all preoccupations and burdens of private life." This is the nature of ulama. They just find so much peace in the sacred gardens of knowledge. The famous statement that if the kings knew what we have in our gatherings of knowledge, they would fight us for it with their swords. That we have this serenity, this peace in the presence of our mashayikh, in the presence of the books of the great ulama that preceded us. And Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur is saying that this was something that was incredibly important to him, that he found his peace in the presence of books, in the presence of ilm, and the inheritance of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. He himself says, the burdens of public trusts I carried in the judiciary and in the educational administration came between me and my delight in lessons. That he felt his position as a judge and his position as the chief mufti and his position as the reform in the reform councils, all of this held were a barrier between him and the understanding that he wanted to get from the knowledge, but not between me and my sons, who are nothing but a source of joy and a matter of pride. And he always devoted himself evidently to his family, to his, what is it, 5 sons and 2 daughters. Muhammad Khadir Hussain, so we spoke about him already. My admiration for the radiance of his character and the graciousness of his manners is no less than my admiration for his genius in knowledge. I saw a tongue whose speech was truth, and this is the quote we read before, an inner self pure of every evil thought, an ambition aspiring to lofty matters, a diligence in work untouched by weariness, and a preservation of the duties and etiquettes of religion. The professor, the sheikh, the doctor, the allama, I think this is a translation of al-allama, grew up with superior intelligence, brilliance, and leadership, and it was not long before his genius became apparent to the people of knowledge. Here we have um, Dr. Muhammad al-Habib ibn al-Khuja. This is one of his students, unique despite advanced age and presence of mind. So even though he was very old, this is 10 years, I think, rahimahullah, before he passed away, he was incredibly just aware, just conscious of everything around him, and his memory was still pristine. I remember asking him in August 1963 after afternoon prayer about a subtle point of grammatical analysis that was unclear to me. Suddenly, this is the thing with the ulama, you come to them with a question, suddenly they come alive. It's like they're just there and just static, and then suddenly they come alive. Suddenly, the Imam was elaborating on its explanation and expounding on different aspects, citing what Ibn Hisham had mentioned in Al-Mughni and in At-Tasrih, as if he were reading from a book. Such was his manner in everything he was asked about. Just so humble. You ask him a question, he comes to life. And now he's quoting from all of these sources that he studied or he's taught throughout his life. We have some other quotes, and I'll do them quite quickly. An anonymous quote: I saw in him an awe inspiring sheikh who represents the continuation of the Salaf al-Salih in his demeanor. He has entered his 10th decade, and years have not taken anything from him. Tall, slender stature, light of flesh, youthful mind, rich in the knowledge that it's taken, retentive heart that has mastered the sciences of those who came before and those who are around now. Eloquent tongue, capable of delving into all kinds of knowledge, open mind that branches out in conversation with dignity that adorns it, and virtue that clarifies it, and good morals and character that cheerfully welcome guests and the newcomer. So many different quotes that the ulama mention about him and his just love for the people, love for his students, love for knowledge, and just his impeccable character and his humility. Rahimahullah ta'ala. In 1933, we mentioned there is this great scandal. Wow, scandal is a strong word. But there's this crisis, this difficulty that Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur rahimahullah ta'ala goes through, and it's his removal from the position as the Shaykh al-Islam of the Maliki. After a year and a half, he's removed from his position. And there's a variety of different things. There's 3 causes that the author of the biography we're using mentions. Number one is that he carries out educational reforms. He's changing lesson timings. He's being more, I was going to say pedantic, more punctual with lesson timings and giving out of subjects to different teachers and making sure that everybody's teaching their fixed lessons. He's also so he's doing all of the he's introducing books into the curriculum, subjects into the curriculum that aren't there. And so this is grinding people, this is rubbing people the wrong way. They're grinding their gears, they're not too happy with what he's doing. He also has the controversial fatwa on naturalization. Now we'll talk about naturalization later, in a second, sorry. Nafi Bashir has a good explanation of it in his biography. But also some of the more conservative scholars, like his own teachers, Bayram, Sheikh Umar al-Shaykh, Sheikh Saleh al-Sharif, they also join the movement against him to get him removed from his positions. In response to his removal, this is his student again, Ibn al-Khuja, patient through tribulations and did not complain about anybody. Despite campaigns stirred up against him, I did not find in his scholarly criticism anything that offended taste or violated dignity. He wouldn't descend to this position of now throwing slurs at people, engaging in the lowest level of discourse. He was somebody who was always so dignified in his approach to everything. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have immense mercy on him. Now, what is the naturalization crisis? The naturalization crisis, so basically what happens is the French, in their control of Tunisia, they allow people to adopt French citizenship. So the Tunisians, the Muslims of Tunisia, can now become French citizens. And I think this comes in quite early in the 20th century. And most Muslims don't take it on because there is this assumption that by abandoning your Tunisian identity, well, I don't know if there is such thing as a Tunisian identity, but to come under French citizenship is to accept French law, French customs, French ideas of authority, the French governance, and all of these is seen at least as stepping away from the Sharia, abandoning the Sharia of Islam and the laws of Islam, and accepting French sovereignty. And that is the assumption. And initially, not many people took it on, but as things became more difficult for people and Tunisian citizenship wasn't opening the doors maybe for things that they wanted in their lives, more and more people started to gravitate towards it. And so the ulama had to give a fatwa. Is it permissible for people to take on uh, French citizenship? This is the naturalization crisis. Um, and you have essentially two positions. One is, and this is the Mufti of, I have no idea how to say this, Bezerte or something, but this is one of the Muftis who gives a fatwa saying that you can't take it on. Anybody who takes on French citizenship is considered a kafir murtad, and they cannot be buried in Muslim graveyards. This has a massive effect because then people start considering anybody who actually does take French citizenship as a kafir. And there are even accounts that they would go to graveyards and find the bodies of these people who would be buried in Muslim graveyards as French citizens and remove their bodies from these graveyards, from the Muslim graveyards, because you're not a Muslim. You're not allowed to be buried in our graveyards. So the French government then had to build or create separate graveyards for naturalized French Muslim citizens who they could be buried without any interference from these people who felt that they had stepped outside the realm of Islam by accepting French sovereignty and French citizenship. On the other side, you had certain muftis who gave fatwa saying, oh, it's fine, because they didn't want to cause any issues with the French authorities. Maybe they had some sort of government post, but they didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And so they said, no, actually, this is not a big problem. You're still a Muslim as long as you're still a believer. And this doesn't entail the removal of your Islam from you by virtue of you accepting French citizenship. Now, obviously, at this time in 1932-33, Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur has just been appointed the Grand Sheikh al-Islam of the Malikiya of Tunisia, the first Maliki Sheikh al-Islam of Tunisia. And so the mas'ala is brought to before him. What does Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur rahimahullah have to say on the naturalization crisis that takes place in 32 and 33? And he gives this sort of middle path ruling, which you would expect from a senior jurist like him to say that, here we have it, a naturalization is sinful. And so here I have it here, actually, I'll read it out. A naturalized Tunisian may be buried in a Muslim cemetery if he repented before death and reaffirmed his faith. So it's bad, but if you make tawbah before you pass away, you can be buried in a Muslim cemetery. So he affirmed that French citizenship did remove you from Islamic law and put you under the sovereignty of a non-Islamic legal system. But he said, as long as you make tawbah, you can enter back in to Islam and be buried in a Muslim graveyard. So this now, people didn't like this. This caused a lot of issues. Now, obviously, those who wanted citizenship were quite happy with the fatwa he's given because they just have to make tawbah. But the nationalists, those who wanted independence from the French, saw him that he has succumbed to French authority and given a fatwa that allows for people to remove themselves from Islamic sovereignty, from Islamic governance, from Tunisian sovereignty, whatever that is, and enter into a collaboration with the French. And they saw him as a collaborator. And this claim would stay with him for a very long time. This slur that he was some sort of collaborator, that he was working in hand with the French, that he was some sort of billah, traitor, treacherous to the Muslims, which he wasn't at all. Because he was just a mufti, he was just giving the fatwa. He was trying to reconcile between the two hardline positions and give people a way out. And this is what a mufti does. Yes, Siru, you have to make affairs easy for people. That's what the job of the great mufti. And on the other side, the French aren't too happy because they're like, well, why are you saying it's sinful? Why is it sinful to be French? Why is it haram to be French? I don't know if it's haram to be French. The French have done a lot of bad things to Muslims over the last 200 years, and sometimes still carry on doing things by banning the hijab and all of the crimes that they carried out against the Muslims of Algeria. So maybe there is something to this idea of it's haram to be French. Allah knows best. But they weren't too happy either. So now he's now in this strange position. And ultimately, Um, he so his intention, avoid violent escalation. He doesn't want things to escalate. He's a mufti. He understands that you need to maintain social cohesion, social order, and at the same time, he doesn't want the French to come back on him because he recognizes he is in a position of authority and he wants to maintain some level of that authority because he feels like that's the most helpful he can be for the Muslim community. So he seeks this moderate solution, and the public saw him as pro-French. Protests spread. People are now protesting against him. They want him to be removed, reputation tarnished, and he is ultimately removed from his position. Later, about 10 years later, he gets it back, but for that period now, he is attacked, he is besmirched, people say horrible things about him, people are writing things against him, his own teachers are refuting him, asking for him to be removed from his position, accusing him of some very, very horrendous things. And so this is a very, very difficult period in his life that he has to maintain patience in the face of, and they say he was incredibly steadfast in everything that he faced at this moment. And so now we have our final quotes. These are just poetry. Sorry, this is just poetry that some of his students wrote about him. Um, and so we have, um, yeah, you could just read the English translation yourself. Um, and I'll come to the last slide, and then we'll start looking next week at some of the works, and hopefully we'll make that a session in and of itself. So, but anyways, the naturalization crisis, the steadfastness he showed in the face. There's a lot of interesting questions about nation states, about colonial authorities, about non-Islamic law, non-Islamic law at the very least. How should Muslims navigate living in non-Islamic legal systems, non-Islamic political governances? How did the ulama deal with it in the first instance in India, in other places? And here we have an example of how the ulama of Tunisia dealt with it, with these various different approaches, and each of them is their ijtihad, and we affirm Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur rahimahullah ta'ala his right to give the fatwa that he did. Um, and it's quite sad actually what happened to him.